Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The first recorded mention of Moss Hollow appeared in 1849, though local historians believe the settlement may have existed for at least a decade prior. Located deep within the Atchafalaya Basin of Louisiana, approximately 23 miles southwest of what is now St. Martinville, this community remained absent from official maps until a land survey conducted in 1852 briefly acknowledged its existence before the documentation mysteriously disappeared from state records. What little we know comes from fragmentary sources. A water-damaged journal recovered from the home of Reverend Thomas Whitfield in 1863, partial census records from 1850 that contain peculiar notations, and oral accounts passed down through generations of families residing in neighboring parishes. These stories speak of a place where runaway slaves established not just a hiding spot, but an entire community beneath the swampland, a network of subterranean dwellings connected by partially flooded tunnels and caverns naturally formed in the limestone beneath the mud. According to the Journal of Elias Montgomery, a cartographer who ventured into the region in 1854, the locals refused to guide me beyond the eastern ridge of cypress trees. When pressed, an elderly man whispered that the ground beyond does not hold its secrets well, and that some nights the earth itself seems to breathe. Montgomery never completed his mapping expedition. His equipment was discovered 3 weeks later, abandoned near a sinkhole approximately 7 miles from his last recorded position. His body was never recovered. The community was reportedly founded by a man known only as Solomon, a skilled carpenter who'd escaped from the Fairchild plantation in northern Mississippi in 1838. What makes this case particularly unusual is not merely the existence of a hidden settlement. Numerous maroon communities existed throughout the South during the antebellum period, but rather the elaborate nature of its construction and the disturbing events surrounding its eventual abandonment. According to interviews conducted with descendants of former slaves in 1896 by Tulane University researcher Harold Jenkins, Solomon possessed an uncanny understanding of the swamp's geography. Jenkins wrote, "The elderly woman insisted that Solomon could predict where sinkholes would form weeks before they appeared. She claimed her grandmother told her he would press his ear to the ground each morning and listen to what she called the swamp's heartbeat." Jenkins' research notes abruptly end with a curious observation. Subject became agitated when asked about the community's water source. Refused to continue interview. What we know with greater certainty is that in July of 1855, a hunting party from St. Martinville stumbled upon evidence of the settlement after following an unusual trail of disturbed vegetation. The men reported their findings to local authorities, who organized a larger expedition. This group, comprising 12 men, including a county sheriff and 2 representatives from nearby plantations, departed on August 3, 1855. Only 5 returned 4 days later, and their accounts of what they discovered differ so dramatically that investigators eventually dismissed them as delusional from swamp fever or consumption of tainted water. One consistent element in their testimonies, however, was the description of a series of mud brick structures partially submerged beneath the water, with narrow passages leading deeper into the earth. Sheriff James Holcomb wrote in his official report, "We observed what appeared to be handcrafted wooden support beams extending from the dwelling entrances down into the murky water. The craftsmanship was unlike anything I have witnessed, with joints that seemed to lock together without nails or bindings." The report was filed, but subsequently removed from county records during Reconstruction. An article published in the St. Martinville Courier on August 12, 1855, mentions the expedition only briefly. The party, sent to investigate rumors of unauthorized habitation in the southern marshlands, has returned with reports of abandoned structures. No individuals were apprehended. No follow-up articles appear in subsequent issues. However, a personal letter written by expedition member William Preston to his brother in Charleston, dated August 17, 1855, tells a different story. I cannot shake the memory of that place. The tunnels extended far beyond what should be possible given the flooding. We followed one passage for what must have been half a mile, our torches revealing walls lined with strange markings. Not African symbols, as Reverend Barnes suggested, but something altogether different. They seemed to pulse in the flickering light. Davidson became separated from our group for only minutes, yet when we found him, he insisted he had been wandering for hours, conversing with individuals he could not describe. This letter was discovered among family papers donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1932. What makes the Moss Hollow case particularly disturbing is what happened in the weeks following the expedition. 3 of the returning men died under unusual circumstances. Thomas Davidson, who had reportedly become separated from the group, was found hanging from a cypress tree near his home on September 1st. The coroner ruled it suicide, noting that Davidson had been suffering from nervous agitation since his return. Robert Jenkins died of what was recorded as swamp fever on September 9th, though his wife later claimed his symptoms included waking terrors and the sensation of water filling his lungs, despite being nowhere near water. Sheriff Holcomb resigned his position on September 21st and reportedly left Louisiana entirely, though no records exist of where he relocated. The most detailed account of what the expedition may have encountered comes from a journal believed to have belonged to Solomon himself, discovered during a drainage project in 1964. The journal, heavily damaged by water and time, contains entries spanning from 1839 to 1854. The handwriting changes noticeably over time, becoming increasingly precise and geometric. An entry dated January 23, 1843 states, "We have completed the Western Passage today. The ground is more stable than expected. The water seeps in predictable patterns now, and I can hear where it will come next. 27 souls now reside in our hollow. None wish to return to the world above." Another entry, dated March 10, 1846, reads, "The deeper chambers remain dry even after the heavy rains. Strange echoes today. The children say they hear singing from the North Passage, though none of our people are there. Must investigate tomorrow." The final legible entry, dated May 4, 1854, consists of a single sentence: "It has found us." What "it" might have referred to remains unknown, as does the fate of the settlement's inhabitants. No bodies were ever recovered from the site, and no records exist of former Moss Hollow residents appearing in other communities or registering with Freedmen's Bureau offices after the Civil War. A geological survey conducted by Louisiana State University in 1948 noted unusual formations in the area where Moss Hollow was believed to have been located. Professor Richard Garrett wrote, "The depression patterns suggest a network of chambers approximately 15 to 20 feet beneath the current swamp level. However, core samples indicate the presence of hardened clay not native to this region, almost as if the cavities had been lined with manufactured material. More puzzling are the traces of salt water found at this depth, despite being over 70 miles from the Gulf." In 1957, anthropologist Margaret Wilkins attempted to organize a proper archaeological investigation of the site, but abandoned her efforts after funding was unexpectedly withdrawn. In her personal notes, later donated to Tulane University's archives, she wrote, "Department cited safety concerns after the second sinkhole formed near our equipment. Jenkins insists it was precisely where we had planned to begin excavation the next day. Hard not to see the timing as peculiar." What is perhaps most unsettling about the Moss Hollow case is not what was found, but what remains hidden. In 1968, During the height of the civil rights movement, historian Benjamin Carter published a controversial paper suggesting that federal authorities had deliberately suppressed information about Moss Hollow and similar communities. Carter wrote, "The narrative of helpless, dependent slaves waiting for liberation did not align with evidence of self-sufficient, organized communities operating beyond plantation boundaries. Moss Hollow represents not just a historical curiosity, but a challenge to established power structures." Carter's paper was largely dismissed by his colleagues, and he never published on the subject again. His research materials were reportedly damaged in a basement flood at Howard University in 1969. However, a former student of Carter's who requested anonymity during a 1982 oral history project claimed that Carter had received a package containing a small wooden box carved with unusual geometric patterns shortly before abandoning his research. The student stated, "He opened it while I was in his office. Inside was a single piece of parchment with what looked like a map and something else, something small that I couldn't see clearly. Whatever it was, it drained the color from his face. He asked me to leave immediately. The next day, he announced he was taking a sabbatical. He packed up his office that same week." Local residents have long reported unusual phenomena in the vicinity of the presumed Moss Hollow site. Persistent accounts describe unexplained lights visible through the mist on particularly humid nights. Others mention a low, resonant humming that seems to emanate from beneath the ground during certain phases of the moon. Wildlife behaves strangely in the area. Hunters note that animals avoid a roughly circular region approximately 2 miles in diameter, despite the abundance of suitable habitat. In 1962, trapper Jerome Thibodeau told the Lafayette Gazette that he had discovered what appeared to be a partial tunnel entrance after a particularly severe storm had uprooted several cypress trees. The opening was perfectly round, about the size of a wagon wheel, lined with what looked like fired clay, he reported. "I shined my light down but couldn't see bottom. I dropped a stone and never heard it land." When asked if he had reported his finding to authorities, Thibodeau allegedly laughed and said, "Some things better left alone." Attempts to locate the entrance based on Thibodeau's description proved unsuccessful. What happened to Solomon and his community remains one of the most enduring mysteries in Louisiana's history. Some historians suggest that the inhabitants simply abandoned the settlement after their location was discovered, dispersing to other maroon communities or fleeing north. Others propose more troubling scenarios, pointing to the lack of physical evidence of migration and the abrupt nature of the apparent abandonment. The Journal of Reverend Thomas Whitfield, discovered after his death in 1863, contains a curious entry dated October 17th, 1855. "Visited by a man today who claimed to have come from beneath the earth. His clothes were caked with a grey mud, unlike any I've seen in this parish. He would not give his name, but asked if I would record that they had gone deeper, where the voices led them. When I asked for clarification, he said only that Solomon had found another way down, and that they would not be returning. The man left before sunrise. The mud he tracked into my study had hardened like cement by morning." Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made during a Corps of Engineers drainage project in 1959. Workers uncovered what appeared to be a narrow vertical shaft, approximately 3 feet in diameter, extending downward into the bedrock. The walls of the shaft were lined with the same fired clay described in earlier accounts. Project supervisor Harold Williams reported that the shaft descended at least 60 feet before narrowing further, beyond the reach of their equipment. At the bottom of the accessible portion, workers recovered a single item, a hand-carved wooden box containing 27 small figurines, each depicting a human form in various poses. The figurines were carved from a dense black wood that botanists were unable to identify. According to Williams' report, the figurines were sent to the University of Louisiana for analysis. However, university records contain no mention of their arrival, and William's subsequent inquiries regarding their whereabouts were met with bureaucratic deflection. In a letter to his superior dated March 3, 1960, Williams wrote, "I find it peculiar that no one can account for artifacts of such potential historical significance. More troubling is the denial by some officials that we encountered any shaft or structure whatsoever." Williams was reassigned to a project in Arkansas the following month. The area believed to contain the remains of Moss Hollow has been subjected to significant environmental changes over the past century. Drainage projects, industrial development, and natural shifts in the swamp's hydrology have altered the landscape dramatically. In 1968, a portion of the region was designated as protected wetland, effectively halting any further exploration or development. The official reasoning cited ecological concerns, though some local historians have suggested the timing, coinciding with renewed interest in the Moss Hollow case following Carter's publication, raises questions about the decision's true motivation. Today, the precise location of Moss Hollow remains uncertain. Modern mapping techniques, including ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, have identified several anomalies beneath the current swamp level that could correspond to the described settlement. However, the combination of protected status, challenging terrain, and the area's reputation has prevented comprehensive investigation. A curious footnote to the story emerged in 1967, when an elderly woman named Clara Johnson was interviewed as part of a folk history project in St. Landry Parish. Johnson, then 93, claimed her grandmother had been among the original inhabitants of Moss Hollow. According to the transcript, Johnson stated, "Grandmama said Solomon wasn't building a refuge. He was building a doorway. They found something down there in the wet dark, something old. Older than slavery, older than America. It promised them freedom, but not the kind they thought." When asked to elaborate, Johnson reportedly smiled and said, "Some chains you can see, some you can't." The recording of this interview was catalogued in the Louisiana State University folklore collection, but was reported missing during an inventory conducted in 1968. The written transcript remains the only record of Johnson's testimony. She passed away in 1969, taking whatever additional knowledge she possessed to her grave. Perhaps the most rational explanation for the abandonment of Moss Hollow lies in the environmental conditions of the region. Geologists note that the area experiences periodic flooding and unstable ground conditions that would make long-term subterranean habitation challenging, if not impossible. The community may have succumbed to natural disaster, a collapse or sudden flooding, with survivors scattered and records lost to time. Yet this explanation fails to account for the more unusual elements of the case: the apparent sophistication of the construction, the lack of physical remains, and the consistent reports of inexplicable phenomena associated with the site. These aspects have fueled speculation ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Some suggest that Moss Hollow represents evidence of advanced engineering knowledge among enslaved populations that has been deliberately obscured from historical record. Others propose more outlandish theories involving underground waterways leading to the Gulf, or even connections to indigenous legends of subterranean worlds. What can be stated with certainty is that something existed in the swamps southwest of St. Martinville, a community that left behind just enough evidence to confirm its presence, but insufficient information to paint a complete picture of its nature or fate. The fragmentary records, inconsistent testimonies, and physical anomalies create a historical puzzle that continues to resist solution. In 1954, historian Eliza Montgomery, no relation to the disappeared cartographer, wrote perhaps the most fitting assessment of the case. Moss Hollow represents a peculiar type of historical ghost, substantial enough to cast a shadow across documented history, yet insubstantial enough to evade definitive capture within our understanding. It exists in the margin between established fact and folklore, between the world we acknowledge and the world we sense but cannot name. On rare occasions, visitors to the Atchafalaya Basin report hearing unusual sounds emanating from beneath the murky waters. A rhythmic tapping that some have likened to carpentry tools or the construction of wooden structures. Park rangers dismiss these accounts as the natural sounds of the swamp, water movement, shifting timber, or the activities of wildlife. Yet the reports persist, particularly during the spring months when water levels fluctuate. In 1963, a soil sample collected approximately 11 miles from the presumed Moss Hollow site contained traces of an unusual clay compound with properties similar to modern concrete. Analysis indicated the material had been fired at temperatures difficult to achieve with 19th century technology. The results were noted as anomalous, and the sample was scheduled for further testing. Records indicate it was transferred to a facility in Atlanta, but arrival was never confirmed. Local folklore has incorporated elements of the Moss Hollow mystery into broader narratives about the region. Some fishing guides speak of Solomon's Chambers when referring to particularly deep sections of the swamp. Others warn against venturing too far into certain areas after sunset, claiming that the boundaries between worlds grow thin when darkness falls over the water. The descendants of those who once lived near Moss Hollow maintain a curious tradition. When building new homes, some families place a small sealed clay box beneath the northeast corner of the foundation. When asked about this practice, many claim ignorance of its origin or purpose. Others offer vague explanations about keeping the ground solid or respecting what came before. The contents of these boxes remain a closely guarded secret, though rumors suggest they contain soil, small wooden carvings, or written messages. During particularly dry summers, when water levels in the basin drop significantly, local authorities report an increase in unauthorized expeditions into remote areas of the swamp. In 1958, 1967, and 1965, all drought years, multiple groups were intercepted attempting to access restricted areas with excavation equipment. None offered clear explanations for their interest in these specific locations. A handwritten note discovered in the margins of a surveyor's map dated 1856 offers perhaps the most haunting suggestion of what may have become of Moss Hollow's inhabitants. The cramped script, barely legible, reads, "They did not flee, they did not die, they descended." The story of Moss Hollow remains incomplete, a historical fragment that refuses neat categorization or convenient explanation. What began as a search for freedom evolved into something else entirely, something that continues to evade full understanding more than a century later. The swamp keeps its secrets, buried beneath layers of mud, water, and time. Occasionally, something surfaces, a document, an artifact, an unusual geological finding that briefly illuminates a portion of the mystery before being reabsorbed into the greater enigma. Those who study the case today approach it with caution, aware of the pattern of disappeared evidence, abandoned research, and unexplained phenomena that has followed previous investigations. Some information remains deliberately withheld, passed down through family lines rather than submitted to academic scrutiny. "Some stories aren't meant for everyone to know," explained one elderly resident of St. Martinville in 1965 when asked about local knowledge of the settlement. "Some truths belong to those who earned them." The last official attempt to locate physical evidence of Moss Hollow occurred in 1967, when a team from the University of Louisiana conducted a limited survey using then-new sonar technology. Their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, producing images described as inconsistent with known geological formations. The project was abandoned after less than a week, ostensibly due to budget constraints. 3 team members reportedly resigned their positions shortly afterward. Today, the area remains largely inaccessible, protected by both natural obstacles and legal restrictions. Those who venture near the presumed location often report a sense of being watched, of eyes following their movements from beneath the dark water. Wildlife behaves erratically. Birds fall silent. Insects cease their constant hum. The air feels heavier, charged with an inexplicable tension. What truly happened to Solomon and the 27 souls who followed him beneath the swamp remains unknown. No bodies, no definitive evidence of their fate has ever been recovered. Only fragments remain. Unusual clay formations, inexplicable structures beneath the mud, stories passed through generations in hushed voices. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence is what does not exist. Despite extensive records of runaway slaves throughout the South, no accounts mention individuals who escaped from Moss Hollow. No oral histories describe refugees from the settlement appearing in other communities. Unlike other maroon societies that eventually dispersed, with members reintegrating into broader society, Moss Hollow's inhabitants simply vanished from historical record. As one researcher noted in 1965, it's as if they stepped out of our world entirely. In the spring of 1968, a severe storm caused significant flooding throughout the Atchafalaya Basin. When the waters receded, local fishermen reported that a section of swampland, approximately 17 miles southwest of St. Martinville, had changed. Where there had previously been a slight rise in the landscape, there was now a perfectly circular depression approximately 40 feet in diameter. At its center, a dark opening extended downward into the earth. Authorities cordoned off the area immediately. Official statements cited dangerous conditions and environmental concerns. No journalists were permitted access. 3 days later, the site was permanently restricted under federal wetland protection laws. No official explanation for the formation was ever provided. Those who glimpsed the depression before it was restricted described it as unnaturally perfect in its circumference. One witness, speaking anonymously to a local newspaper, claimed to have seen markings around the rim, like writing, but not any writing I've ever seen. Another reported hearing a sound like singing emanating from the opening, but with no words I could make out. The story of Moss Hollow remains unfinished, a historical phantom that occasionally makes its presence known before retreating back into the shadows. Whatever secrets lie beneath the murky waters of the Atchafalaya Basin, they remain carefully guarded, accessible only through fragments of evidence and the whispered stories of those who live with the knowledge that sometimes the ground beneath our feet holds more than solid earth. For those who know where to look, the signs of Moss Hollow's existence persist, unusual patterns of vegetation that form perfect circles in the swamp. Water that flows against the natural gradient in certain areas, the persistent absence of wildlife in regions that should teem with life. And occasionally, on still nights when the moon is dark, lights that seem to glow beneath the water's surface, moving slowly, deliberately, like lanterns carried by unseen hands. The most recent documented reference to Moss Hollow appeared in 1969 in the will of Elijah Johnson, a descendant of Clara Johnson. Among his possessions was listed one wooden box containing soil from the hollow to be returned to the water upon my death. The executor of his estate reported that the box, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand and carved with intricate geometric patterns, was indeed filled with a dark, dense soil unlike any found in the region. As instructed, it was cast into the waters of the Atchafalaya Basin during a private ceremony attended only by family members. One attendee later described seeing ripples that moved against the current from the point where the box entered the water, as if something beneath the surface had reached up to receive it. Solomon's community, whatever its ultimate fate, remains a disturbing reminder that history is not a complete record, but rather a collection of fragments, some preserved, some lost, some deliberately hidden. The spaces between these fragments, the silences and gaps in our understanding, often contain the most unsettling truths. As the waters of the Atchafalaya continue to rise and fall with the seasons, covering and revealing the secrets buried in the mud, the question remains, did Solomon find the freedom he sought in the depths beneath the swamp? Or did he and his followers discover something else entirely, something that offered a different kind of liberation at a price we can only imagine? The swamp keeps its silence. The waters conceal what lies beneath. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, locals swear they can hear the sound of hammers and saws echoing from below the surface, the sound of something still being built in the depths, one careful piece at a time. Perhaps most unsettling are the accounts from those who have spent their lives on the water. Fishermen and trappers speak of moments when the boundary between surface and depth seems to blur. Raymond Brough, a lifelong resident of St. Martinville who passed away in 1966, told researchers in 1959, "There are places where the bottom ain't really the bottom, where what looks like solid ground shifts if you watch it long enough. My daddy showed me those spots when I was a boy, told me never to drop anchor there, said the mud might decide to pull you down." A geological assessment conducted in 1960 by Louisiana State University identified several anomalous subsurface structures in the region, including what appeared to be a network of chambers approximately 25 to 30 feet beneath the swamp floor. Dr. Howard Phillips, who led the study, noted that the formations did not match typical karst topography expected in limestone regions. The regularity of the spaces suggests either an extremely unusual natural formation or, more controversially, evidence of human modification, he wrote. Phillips requested funding for a more comprehensive investigation, but was denied. He left the university the following year, citing professional differences with the administration. What little physical evidence exists of Moss Hollow has been scattered, lost, or sequestered in private collections. In 1961, a fisherman recovered what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden door from the swamp, approximately 12 miles southwest of St. Martinville. The door, constructed of cypress and measuring roughly 4 feet by 2 feet, featured unusual iron hinges of a design not consistent with 19th-century American craftsmanship. More striking were the symbols carved into its surface, geometric patterns arranged in concentric circles. The fisherman reportedly kept the door in his shed for several weeks before a government man visited and offered to purchase it. The door's current whereabouts are unknown. A photograph of the door, taken by the fisherman's son before its sale, surfaced in 1968 as part of a collection of regional curiosities displayed at a small museum in Lafayette. The curator, when questioned about the item, claimed it had been loaned anonymously and later reclaimed by its owner. The photograph itself disappeared from the museum archives during a reorganization in 1969. In 1962, during a particularly severe drought, water levels in portions of the Atchafalaya Basin dropped to unprecedented lows, revealing topographical features normally concealed beneath several feet of water and mud. Local resident Maurice Thibodeau described seeing what looked like the tops of walls, arranged in a perfect circle in an area approximately 20 miles southwest of St. Martinville. They weren't natural, he insisted in an interview with the Lafayette Gazette. They were placed there, built by human hands. By the time officials arrived to investigate, heavy rains had returned the water to its normal levels, concealing whatever Thibodeau might have seen. Aerial photographs taken by the U.S. Geological Survey during the same drought period show several unusual circular patterns in the vegetation and sediment distribution in the general vicinity described by Thibodeau. Analysis of the images concluded that the formations were likely the result of natural hydrological processes, though several researchers noted the striking regularity of the patterns. The original photographs were damaged during improper storage in 1967, rendering detailed re-examination impossible. The historical record contains one particularly disturbing account that may relate to the fate of Moss Hollow's inhabitants. In September 1855, approximately 1 month after the expedition that reportedly discovered the settlement, a steamboat captain named James Harrington documented an unusual encounter while navigating the lower portion of the Atchafalaya River. In his log, Harrington wrote, "Observed several individuals emerging from the water at the eastern bank. approximately 15 miles north of Morgan City. Most unusual was their appearance, covered head to toe in a grey mud that had hardened on their skin like armor. They moved in a manner I cannot adequately describe, almost mechanically. When hailed, they made no response but turned as one and returned to the water. My first mate, Mr. Collins, insisted we investigate, but I deemed it unwise and continued our journey. I count 27 distinct figures before they disappeared beneath the surface. Harrington's account received little attention at the time, dismissed as either exaggeration or misidentification of local indigenous people. The precise number he recorded, 27, matches the final population of Moss Hollow mentioned in Solomon's recovered journal. This coincidence was not noted until historian Marcus Reynolds connected the accounts in 1958. Reynolds planned a comprehensive article examining possible links between the settlement and Harrington's sighting, but died unexpectedly of a stroke before completing the work. His research materials, including copies of primary documents, were reportedly destroyed in a house fire 3 weeks after his death. The geography of the region itself presents another layer of mystery. Modern hydrological surveys indicate that portions of the Atchafalaya Basin contain unexplained subsurface water flows, currents that move independent of surface patterns and often against the expected gradient. In 1965, hydrologist Patricia Lamont documented what she termed vertical circulation anomalies in the area believed to contain Moss Hollow. Water appears to be moving not just horizontally, but vertically through substrata in patterns that defy conventional hydrological principles, she wrote. More puzzling is the presence of water, with high saline content at depths where freshwater should predominate. Lamont's research suggested the existence of previously unknown subterranean channels connecting to deeper aquifers, or possibly even to the Gulf of Mexico, despite being over 70 miles inland. Such connections could theoretically support the accounts of tunnels and submerged passages described in various historical documents related to Moss Hollow. Lamont planned further investigation but was reassigned to a project in Florida before completing her work. Her preliminary findings were filed but never published in academic journals. The historical context of Moss Hollow adds another dimension to its mystery. The period from 1830 to 1860 saw numerous maroon communities established throughout the southern United States. Settlements of escaped slaves who created independent societies in remote, inaccessible areas. Most of these communities were eventually discovered and disbanded, their inhabitants recaptured or forced to flee further. Those that survived longest were typically found in mountainous regions or dense forests where natural barriers provided protection. What makes Moss Hollow distinctive is its purported subterranean nature. No other documented maroon community attempted to establish permanent underground habitation, particularly in a swamp environment where flooding would present constant challenges. The engineering knowledge required to create stable structures beneath a swamp floor with functional drainage and ventilation systems would have been considerable. Yet historical records indicate that Solomon had worked as a carpenter and had no formal training in mining or subterranean construction. This discrepancy has led some researchers to suggest that the community may have discovered existing natural formations that they subsequently modified, rather than creating entirely new structures. The limestone substrate beneath portions of the Atchafalaya Basin could theoretically contain natural caverns, though such formations are not typically found in the region's geology. Another theory, proposed by geologist Richard Martinez in 1964, suggests that the settlement might have utilized sinkholes and natural depressions as starting points, gradually expanding them into more complex structures. Martinez pointed to unusual mineral deposits found in soil samples from the region as evidence of extensive human manipulation of the subterranean environment. His research was never published, and Martinez declined to discuss the topic in later interviews, citing only professional concerns. The fate of Solomon himself remains perhaps the most enduring question in the Moss Hollow mystery. No records indicate his capture or death, nor is there evidence that he emerged from the swamp to establish himself elsewhere. The last confirmed reference to him appears in his own journal, with the cryptic final entry, "It has found us." In 1960, an elderly woman named Sarah Williams, claiming to be a descendant of a family that had lived near the settlement, told a folklore researcher, "My great-grandmother said Solomon wasn't trying to hide from slave catchers in the end. He was trying to reach something he'd heard calling from the deep places. She said he would sit for hours with his ear pressed to the ground listening, and one day he told everyone he knew where they needed to go." Williams could not or would not elaborate on what this destination might have been. The fragmentary evidence surrounding Moss Hollow has spawned numerous theories over the decades, ranging from the mundane to the fantastic. Some historians suggest that the settlement was simply abandoned after its discovery, with its inhabitants dispersing to other regions. Others propose that the community fell victim to disease or natural disaster, perhaps a catastrophic collapse of their underground structures during flooding. More controversial theories suggest deliberate concealment of evidence by authorities who found the settlement's existence politically problematic, or by private interests seeking to exploit resources discovered by the community. The pattern of disappeared documents, reassigned researchers, and lost artifacts lends some credence to theories of intentional suppression, though no definitive proof has emerged. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Moss Hollow case is the consistency with which those who investigate it eventually abandon their research. Historians, geologists, anthropologists, and journalists who have pursued the story in depth have frequently ended their inquiries abruptly, often leaving positions, changing fields of study, or refusing to discuss their findings. While professional setbacks and personal circumstances provide plausible explanations in individual cases, the pattern itself raises questions. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, who examined the case in the 1950s before suddenly redirecting her research toward Caribbean history, wrote in a private letter discovered after her death, "There is something about this particular story that resists examination. Each thread I pull seems to unravel something else entirely, something I am increasingly certain I do not wish to see in its entirety." Montgomery never published her findings on Moss Hollow, and her research notes were not found among her papers after her death in 1964. The physical landscape itself seems to resist investigation. Attempts to conduct thorough archaeological surveys have been hampered by environmental factors, flooding, shifting terrain, equipment failures. In 1963, a team from Tulane University planned an extensive examination of the area but abandoned the project after 3 members contracted an unusual illness characterized by disorientation, auditory hallucinations, and extreme sensitivity to light. Medical examinations found no known pathogen, and symptoms resolved after the individuals left the region. Local attitudes toward the Moss Hollow mystery reflect a complex relationship with this aspect of regional history. Many residents of parishes near the presumed site display a curious ambivalence, acknowledging the settlement's historical significance while expressing reluctance to discuss specific details. "Some stories belong to the telling, not the writing down," explained one elderly resident in 1957, when asked why local oral traditions about Moss Hollow rarely appeared in written accounts. This reluctance extends to physical proximity as well. Fishing guides and trappers familiar with the basin often avoid certain areas, particularly after sunset. When pressed for explanations, many offer vague references to bad water, or places where the bottom isn't right. Others simply state that some parts of the swamp don't welcome visitors, a sentiment echoed across generations of local inhabitants. In 1968, sociologist Dr. James Peterson noted what he termed a geographic taboo operating in communities surrounding the Atchafalaya Basin. "There exists an unspoken but widely observed prohibition against entering or discussing specific areas," he wrote. This taboo appears strongest among families with the deepest historical ties to the region, suggesting it emerges from historical experience rather than superstition. Peterson's observation aligns with patterns seen in other communities with historical trauma, a collective agreement to avoid certain topics or places associated with disturbing events. The environmental changes to the region over the past century have further complicated attempts to unravel the mystery. Logging operations, oil and gas exploration, flood control measures, and natural shifts in the basin's hydrology have altered the landscape significantly. What might have once been identifiable landmarks or access points have been obscured or destroyed entirely. The swamp reclaims and transforms, burying the past beneath layers of silt and vegetation. Yet despite these changes, the stories persist. They surface in family histories, in the cautious warnings passed from one generation of swamp guides to the next, in the inexplicable gaps in official records. They emerge in the consistent accounts of unusual phenomena associated with specific areas of the basin, areas that correspond, however roughly, to the presumed location of Moss Hollow. In 1963, a hunter named Joseph Martin reported finding what appeared to be a wooden post protruding from the water in a remote section of the swamp. The post, approximately 4 inches in diameter and extending 2 feet above the water's surface, was carved with symbols similar to those described on the door, recovered in 1961. Martin marked the location on his map, but when he returned the following day with a camera, the post had disappeared. He told the St. Martinville Courier, "It wasn't broken off or washed away. The water where it had been was perfectly still, like nothing had ever disturbed it. But I know what I saw." In 1967, during construction of a pipeline approximately 15 miles from the presumed Moss Hollow site, workers uncovered what appeared to be a wooden structure beneath approximately 12 feet of sediment. According to the foreman's report, the structure consisted of interlocking cypress beams formed into a square frame approximately 8 feet on each side. Inside the frame, workers discovered several artifacts: a hand-forged iron tool resembling a chisel, fragments of pottery with unusual geometric designs, and what appeared to be a journal or ledger, its pages fused together by moisture and time. The items were collected by a representative from the company's legal department, ostensibly for transfer to appropriate authorities. No record exists of their arrival at any museum, university, or government office. When questioned later, company officials stated only that items of potential historical interest had been properly processed according to company policy. The workers who made the discovery were transferred to other projects within weeks. The most recent significant development in the Moss Hollow case occurred in 1968, when heavy spring flooding altered water flow patterns throughout the Atchafalaya Basin. When water levels receded, local pilots reported seeing unusual patterns in the vegetation and soil coloration in areas previously submerged. Aerial photographs revealed what appeared to be a series of concentric circles, the largest approximately 300 feet in diameter, visible only from above. Scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey attributed the formations to natural hydrological processes, but noted their unusual regularity. Independent analysts pointed to similarities between these patterns and the geometric designs described in various artifacts associated with Moss Hollow. Before more detailed examination could be conducted, the area was designated as protected wetland, and access was restricted. Today, the story of Solomon and his underground community exists in a liminal space between documented history and regional folklore. The fragmented evidence neither fully confirms nor completely dismisses the more unusual aspects of the accounts. What remains is a historical anomaly, a community that appeared briefly in the official record before vanishing not just physically but historiographically, leaving behind only traces and questions. Those who encounter the story today often find themselves drawn into the same pattern that has characterized its investigation for over a century. Initial fascination, followed by frustration at the fragmentary nature of the evidence, and finally, a curious reluctance to pursue certain threads too far. As one researcher noted in 1965, before abandoning her study, there is an emotional quality to this particular historical mystery that distinguishes it from mere academic curiosity. One gets the unsettling sense that the story is not simply waiting to be discovered, but is instead observing those who seek it. Perhaps the most fitting testimony comes from the journal of William Preston, the expedition member who wrote to his brother about the settlement in 1855. In a personal diary discovered among family papers in 1939, Preston made a final reference to Moss Hollow 2 months after his return. "I find myself unable to speak of what we saw beneath the water and mud, not from fear of disbelief, but from the growing certainty that in describing it I somehow extend its reach. Some discoveries should remain buried, not because they are false, but because they are too true. True in ways our minds are not equipped to accommodate. Solomon found something down there in the dark. I pray it remains there, listening to no one but the water. The swamp continues its slow cycles of flood and recession. The water rises and falls, concealing and revealing by turns. Occasionally something surfaces, a fragment of wood carved with strange symbols, an unexplained formation in the landscape, a story passed down through generations in hushed voices. For brief moments, these fragments offer glimpses of a mystery that has resisted resolution for more than a century. Then the water rises again, the mud settles, the swamp reclaims its secrets, and somewhere beneath the dark surface, in chambers carved from mud and clay and human determination, the story of Solomon and his people continues, a history written not in books or official records, but in the spaces between what is known and what remains hidden. Visitors to the region today occasionally report hearing unusual sounds when the water is still and the night is dark, rhythmic tapping that seems to emanate from beneath the surface, like the sound of construction continuing in hidden places. Others describe a sensation of being watched from below, of eyes following their movements from beneath the murky water. Park rangers and wildlife officials dismiss such accounts as the product of imagination influenced by local legends, or as misinterpretation of natural phenomena, the movement of submerged logs, the activities of nocturnal wildlife, the complex acoustics of the swamp environment. Yet the reports persist, decade after decade, with remarkable consistency. Perhaps Solomon and his community indeed found what he sought when he first led them into the swamp, not merely a refuge from the world that had enslaved them, but a passage to somewhere else entirely. Perhaps the 27 souls who vanished from historical record continue their journey still, in places beyond our understanding. Or perhaps the truth is simpler, but no less haunting. A community that created something extraordinary, only to have their achievements systematically erased from official history, preserved only in fragments and whispers. A testament to human ingenuity and determination, buried beneath mud and water and deliberate forgetting. Whatever the reality, the swamp keeps its counsel. The water conceals more than it reveals. And the story of Moss Hollow remains what it has always been, a disturbing reminder that history is not a complete record, but rather a curated collection, with the most unsettling truths often lying in the spaces between documented facts, in the silences where certainty dissolves into question. As William Preston wrote in his final known reference to the settlement, some doors once opened cannot be closed again. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. Solomon understood this. I believe that is why he went down into the dark water and mud, not to escape what pursued him, but to pursue something that called to him, something that promised answers to questions I dare not even formulate. The waters of the Atchafalaya continue to rise and fall. The mud shifts and settles. And somewhere beneath it all, the mystery of Moss Hollow persists, a historical ghost that refuses to rest, a story that continues to reach up from the depths like hands emerging from dark water, grasping for someone to listen.